My name is Carlo Stagnaro. I'm Energy Director for Istituto Bruno Leoni in Italy. I don't know who was supposed to chair this panel. In principle, I was asked by James Taylor to do so just 5 minutes ago, so I'm very sorry for you. But I will try to do my best or my worst, depending on how you define it. This is the first panel in the track number 3, which is dedicated to impact. And I'm very happy that the issue we are going to deal with today and now is the impacts of policies rather than the impacts of climate change per se, which is what is usually addressed. I'm from Europe, as I said, and in Europe we got a very flourishing production of papers from the European Commission and other government bodies who explain us that if we will not stop using cars and refrigerators and air conditioning and so forth, the sky will fall and earthquake and so forth. Now, I think it's very much useful and important to look also on the other side. Well, what will happen if we will stop to do a number of nice things? And I think this track is devoted to deal with this issue. And the first 3 speakers are what you cannot ask anything best than this. The order we will follow the order which is listed here. That is, the first speaker will be Dennis Avery, then Fred Singer will take the floor, and finally Scott Armstrong will speak. I will ask them to speak for around 15 minutes. Now, I know that in Italian, 15 minutes means anything between 20 minutes and 1 hour and a half. But since we are now in New York, I will try to enforce 15 minutes by American standards.
You're going to give us warnings, are you?
Okay. And because this will leave some time in the end of after the presentation to have some debate and some interaction with the public, which is, I think, very much useful and interesting. So first of all, I want to introduce Dennis Avery, who is the first speaker today. Dennis has been a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute since 1989. Prior to that, he was a senior analyst in the US Department of State, shame on you, and where he won the National Intelligence Medal of Achievement in 1983. He also holds outstanding performance awards from the US Department of Agriculture and the US Commodity Future Trading Commissions. He writes a weekly column on environmental issues that is distributed to the Night Reader Tribune chain of newspapers. He's co-author with Fred Singer of the New York Times bestseller Unstoppable Global Warming, which I think is also in the bags today and which I urge you to read. And he's also author of Global Food Progress, which was published by the Hudson Institute in 1991. And he also wrote Saving the Planet with Pesticides and Plastic, which is a very good suggestion, I believe. So Dennis, you've got the floor, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here in New York with this sterling group of people with the opportunity to truly examine the questions that we are told no longer need to be examined. And unfortunately, this morning, we're going to be talking not just about something that might happen, we're going to be talking about something fairly drastic that has already happened, and the echoes of it are reverberating around the world as we speak. Biofuels. We are committing the world to use huge amounts of its scarcest resource, good land, not to produce food, not to produce fiber, not to accommodate the world's still expanding population, not to feed its pets, but to give energy independence. And in pursuit of that, we've already jacked the price of corn from $1.86 to more than $5 in approximately 2 years. Wheat prices have gone from $4 a bushel to $24. And we've got food riots, as was mentioned last night, in at least a dozen countries already. and the food prices are likely to stay high as far as the biofuels mandates can reach, and that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that this is ecologically the most dangerous time in modern history to start growing large amounts of biofuels. That's our subject this morning. World food needs are set to more than double between now and 2050. Population growth is waning, but it's still occurring. We're likely to add another 25 to 55% to our population before that growth grinds to a halt sometime before 2050. In addition, we're already farming most of the good land, and growing biofuels on the poor land is ominous indeed. Cropland for biofuels would take millions of acres and displace far more wildlife species than should be expected from global warming. Farming's our biggest intrusion on nature. We've already displaced the wildlife species from 37% of the Earth's land area. We've changed the albedo of that land, its reflectance, its absorption of the sun, its climate characteristics, in addition to making it more prone to soil erosion. We're using 70% of the water consumed by humanity on farms, most of it for badly done irrigation. And as of today, all of those impacts are set to double again. The saving grace so far is that we've produced our food on the good land. Of course, that has an obvious virtue. If you grow the food on the good land, you get more yield, so you need fewer acres. What's rarely understood is that the good land never had much biodiversity. The good land had large numbers of a few species. Think about the Great Plains. 60 million bison, 100 million antelope, the required number of wolves. That's 3 species. An interesting set of grasses, but maybe 100. That was the biodiversity of the Great Plains. No trees at all. In Australia, kangaroos, koala bears, parakeets, and grass. The Ukraine once had at least 10 million of an antelope called the saiga. They're in dire trouble now because they're being shot to make, quote, traditional, unquote, Chinese medicines. Read aphrodisiacs. But they were the dominant species over hundreds of thousands of square miles. Brazil's Cerrados Plateau is the new farming frontier. Lots of termites, lots of ants, a few brushy plants, and a very few of a species called the maned wolf. Looks like a cross between the coyote and the fox. Michael Houston, author of Biological Diversity, says, quite rightly, 60 to 80% of the wild species are in warm climates on the poor quality land. The Amazon has an estimated 1 million species. Half of them are spiders and ants, but they're still species. 2,500 fish in the Amazon. The tree species near the city of Manaus, Brazil, nearly 250. Pantanal Marsh on the Brazilian-Argentine border, 3,500 plant species, 650 birds, 400 fish, 100 mammals, and 80 reptiles in a relatively small area. India has 1,200 butterfly species, and Indonesia, which is at a juncture between two quite different ecosystems, 600 mammals, 1,400 birds, 675 reptiles, and 1,300 fish. Okay, human food demand. 6.4 billion today, something between 8 and 10 billion before 2050. And on top of that, we're going to raise the number of people who get the kind of diets we enjoyed this morning from 1.5 billion to probably 7 billion. Almost everybody is going to be rich. Communications, computers, free trade, all kinds of technological marvels being developed and put to use. The success models of the Asian tigers. Everybody's going to eat well, and it's going to take more. It's going to take 3 farming resources for every additional calorie of meat, milk, and eggs. India is already drinking the milk from 200 million cattle, and they say they will eat meat when they can afford it. Their poultry production has been increasing at double-digit rates for the last decade. China has already doubled its meat consumption. Key micronutrients in those high-quality protein foods: iron, zinc, vitamin A, osteoporosis being combated by the dairy products that we eat when we're rich. Never in the history of the world have we had a voluntarily vegetarian society. The closest we've probably come were the Mayans and the Aztecs. When Cortez landed in Mexico City, they found the skulls of 84,000 sacrificial victims lining the causeways. They had been sacrificed at the dedication of a big new temple a few years before. The priests got the heart. I understand that the tribe that captured the victim got the rest, and I understand the favorite recipe involved tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, and onions. This is human history. A few years ago, 1995 actually, I invited Michael Houston to come from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to talk to a farm policy conference in Washington. And he laid out what he said is the ecological mandate for farm policy. He said, grow as much as you sustainably can on the good land, which doesn't have much biodiversity, so you can save the poor land and the vast majority of the biodiversity for nature. During the Jimmy Carter administration, we weren't doing that. We were pursuing biofuels, basically corn ethanol. And then that turned out to be a false alarm. The fuel prices did not stay high. The biofuels mandate expired, and we went back more or less to growing as much as we sustainably could on the best land. In the last 2 years, we've gone off track again. We have massive biofuel mandates in both Europe and the United States. China had one. China had a biofuels mandate. When the food prices started to soar, they said, whoops, and they capped it, and I presume that they will fairly shortly eliminate their biofuels operations because they take too much land and give too little fuel. Sugarcane is better. Sugarcane is 3 times as good as corn ethanol in terms of its effective yield of auto fuel. It's still a lousy way to run your cars, even aside from having to nickel plate the inside of the engines to prevent corrosion. And the palm oil plantations have already revealed the massive downside of biofuels. It turns out that orangutans, one of the great ape species, love palm oil seedlings. And when the Indonesians clear big tracts of tropical forest and plant zillions of palm oil seedlings, the orangutans come out of the forest and pluck them out and eat them and are captured. There's an organization in Indonesia that will repatriate captured orangutans for only $3,500 per beast. You can imagine how many are being repatriated, and you don't want to ask what happens to the ones who are not. The Green Revolution. How many of you remember the name Norman Borlaug? He's the advisor to our board of directors, one of the giants of our time. And his Green Revolution not only saved 1 billion people from starving, but it saved 16 million square miles of forest land from being plowed down for more low-yield crops. We tripled the effective crop yield on most of the world's good farmland. Did we save that land to grow biofuels? I think not. Did Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund rise to prominence and political power in this world by clearing wildlife habitat for low-yield crops? I think not. And yet, that's where we are today. We're going to have a pet challenge. 53% of the Australians have cats and or dogs. If China reaches America's pet saturation, that'll be an additional 500 million companion animals, none of them vegetarian. We're bidding every possible acre of cleared land into biofuels, $24 for wheat, just an astonishing price, and that means the chainsaws are not far behind. If the mandates stay, there will have to be more land. What about higher crop yields? One of the genetically modified folks out in Iowa says he expects the corn yields there are going to jump from 200 bushels an acre now to 270 very shortly. Won't that be wonderful? That won't even cover the food and feed requirements for 2050. We've got to double the food output again, in addition to whatever yield increase we'd need to support biofuels. Cellulosic ethanol. Everybody wants it. Nobody is able to produce it. We don't know when we'll be able to. We don't know what kind of conversion factors there'll be. We don't know what costs are implied or what land requirements. It's better right now to burn the biomass in a boiler than to run it through an ethanol plant. We have lost no species to global warming, not one. They thought the golden toad of Costa Rica had been lost to higher temperatures. Turns out they had cleared the lower slopes of the golden toad's mountain for farming, for beef production, and it changed the climate characteristics of the cloud forest. It was not higher temperatures, it was deforestation. Let me point out that our net warming since 1850 is 0.7 of a degree. net warming since 1940, when we started seriously spewing greenhouse emissions, 0.2 of a degree, and I'll gladly give Al Gore half of that for the sake of the debate. Understand that there is a massive global moderate climate cycle. We discovered it in the Greenland ice cores in the 1980s, and then found it as well in the Vostok ice cores a few years later. Since have found it in the seabed sediments of 9 oceans, the lake mud of hundreds of lakes, tree rings, cave stalagmites, fossil pollen all over the world. If you want to check this out, it's in our book, Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. This is our climate history for the last 12,000 years. It's always unstable, and the changes are typically abrupt. What we're seeing is not different. It's just something that was too moderate to be perceived by people who didn't have written records and thermometers. The correlation is with sunspots, not CO2. The upper graph is the sunspot index plus our temperatures, factoring a roughly 10-year lag. The lower graph is CO2, which, as you can see, is almost totally unrelated to the Earth's temperatures. Because this cycle is natural, because the wildlife has been through it before, we will not lose species to global warming. The guy who said we'd lose 1 million species himself has documented the recent spread of British birds. The British birds have moved an average 19 kilometers north between 1970 and 1990, lost no habitat in the south. One of the reasons for this is that trees and plants are cold limited, but they're not warmth limited. So replacement of plant species has to take time, decades, perhaps centuries, and the birds and the animals adapt with them. In Ontario, the beech trees dominated the forests during the warmings, the oak trees during the transitions, the pine trees during the depths of the Little Ice Age. We're now back to the oaks, and the beech trees are waiting. Polar bears, we've recently discovered the jawbone of the oldest polar bear yet found. It's carbon dated to at least 110,000 years ago. That means it lived through all of those warmings I showed you in the ice record, plus the Eemian warming before the last ice age that was warmer than anything we've had since. We don't know how. We don't know the polar bear's coping strategy, but every species on the planet today has a global warming, global cooling coping strategy. They're here. And our forests and meadows on the planet today have a richer set of plants and animals than they've had since the medieval warming. I talked last night, my dinner partner was a teacher from Erie, Pennsylvania. She said, "We're losing so many species." I said, "We're not. They're happily coexisting in a richer biodiversity than we've seen since the last warming, and that will last until the next cooling, which comes we know not when. Could be soon. Real dangers from global warming: floods, yes. Famine, but the crop yields have been rising. Storms are fewer and milder during the warmings. Deaths: cold is more than twice as deadly to people than warming, particularly with strokes and high blood pressure. Tropical diseases: we're fending off malaria with window screens and, if need be, with DDT, not with temperatures. So the biggest reason not to grow a lot of biofuels is because we don't need to. That's the climate cycle factor. The second reason is that using lots of land to grow biofuels will destroy far more wildlife species than we'd lose to the global warming. Remember, 0.2 of a degree over 70 years. If the first projections of the climate models were correct, our temperatures would already have risen 6 degrees Celsius. Go forth. You've been deputized. We need to rescind the biofuels mandates immediately.